At my daughter's funeral, my son-in-law smirked and said to me, "I got the $18 million mansion and set aside $5,000 for you. Now disappear from my life." So I picked up my phone, dialed my daughter's number, and put it on speaker. His blood froze when he heard the voice. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. I never thought I'd be standing at my own daughter's graveside at 63, watching them lower her casket into the ground while her husband stood beside me with barely concealed impatience. The autumn wind cut through my old coat, but nothing could have prepared me for the cold that would settle in my chest when Stephen finally showed his true face. Audrey had been my everything after my wife Margaret passed 15 years ago. My brilliant, successful daughter who built a real estate empire from nothing, who bought that $18 million mansion in Beverly Hills, not to show off, but because she said she wanted space for the grandchildren we both hoped she'd have someday. Now she was gone at 35, and I felt like someone had torn my heart right out of my chest. The service was small, which surprised me. Audrey had so many friends, colleagues, people who respected her in business. But Stephen had insisted on a private ceremony. "Just close family," he said. Looking around at the handful of people gathered, I realized how much Stephen had isolated her in these last months. I couldn't stop staring at the casket. My little girl, who used to climb into my lap when she had nightmares, was in there. The doctors said it was a sudden heart condition, completely unexpected in someone so young and healthy. But Audrey had always been strong. She ran marathons, ate right, never smoked. It didn't make sense. "Dad," Stephen's voice broke through my thoughts. He was standing too close, his breath warm against my ear. "We need to talk." I nodded, not trusting my voice. The last mourners were leaving, offering their condolences with awkward pats on my shoulder. Stephen had barely acknowledged them, checking his watch more than once during the service. For a man who just lost his wife, he seemed remarkably composed. We walked back toward the parking area in silence. Stephen was driving a new Porsche, I noticed. When had he gotten that? Audrey always preferred practical cars. She used to tease Stephen about his expensive tastes, how he liked to spend money they didn't have yet. "Listen, Eric," Stephen said, leaning against his car with his arms crossed. The way he said my name, not Dad like he had for the past 8 years, made something twist in my stomach. "I know this is difficult, but we need to discuss the practical matters." I stared at him, waiting. He was wearing an expensive black suit I'd never seen before, his hair perfectly styled, even at a funeral. There was something different about his posture, the way he held himself, like he was finally free to be himself. "Audrey left everything to me, as you'd expect," he continued, his voice taking on a businesslike tone that made me feel sick. "The house, the company, all the assets. But she did mention you in her will." My hands were shaking as I reached into my pocket for my car keys. "I don't care about money, Stephen. I just lost my daughter." I know. He held up his hand like he was calming a difficult client. "But the thing is, Eric, Audrey and I discussed this extensively before she passed. We both agreed that it would be best if you had some distance from all of this. Fresh start, you know?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "What are you talking about?" Stephen reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "Audrey set aside $5,000 for you. It should be enough to help you relocate somewhere nice, maybe Arizona or Florida, one of those retirement communities." The envelope felt like it weighed nothing in my hands, but the words hit me like a physical blow. $5,000 from an $18 million estate, my daughter's life work, reduced to what felt like a tip for a lifetime of loving her. "Stephen, I don't understand. The house, that was supposed to be for family. Audrey always said she wanted space for all of us, for holidays, for her children, Eric," which she never had. His voice was getting harder now, losing the pretense of sympathy. "Look, I'm being generous here. Legally, you're not entitled to anything." Audrey was very clear about her wishes. I stared at him, this man I'd welcomed into my family, who I'd walked down the aisle with when he married my daughter. "You're telling me to take $5,000 and disappear?" "I'm telling you that this is what Audrey wanted." Stephen straightened up, and for the first time I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes that I'd never noticed before. "She felt that you'd had your time raising her, And now it was time for us to move forward without the complications of extended family. The words felt like knives. Complications. That's what I was to him. Not Audrey's father, not family, just a complication to be resolved with a check. He would never say that, I whispered. But even as I said it, doubt crept in. Audrey had been distant these past few months. Canceled dinners, brief phone calls, always saying she was busy with work. Maybe Stephen was telling the truth. Maybe my daughter really had decided I was no longer welcome in her life. Stephen smiled then, and it was the cruelest thing I'd ever seen. Audrey changed a lot in these last months, Eric. She realized what really mattered, and what really mattered was our future together, not clinging to the past. He got into his Porsche and rolled down the window. I'd appreciate it if you could clear out of the area within the next week or two. I'm planning to sell your old house anyway. Audrey thought the neighborhood was going downhill. My old house. The one Audrey had insisted on buying for me 5 years ago when I retired, right around the corner from their place. She said she wanted me close, that family should stick together. Now Stephen was calling it my old house, like it was some burden she'd carried. As Stephen drove away, leaving me standing alone in the cemetery parking lot, I felt something break inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be fixed. But as I stood there, clutching that envelope, something else nagged at me. Something about the way Stephen had smiled, the way he'd been checking his watch during the service, the way he seemed so eager to get rid of me. Audrey always told me I was too trusting, that I didn't see people's true motives clearly enough. Maybe it was time I started paying closer attention, because the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the Stephen I'd just talked to wasn't the same man who'd married my daughter 8 years ago. He was someone else entirely, and that scared me more than I wanted to admit. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Stephen's cold smile, heard his voice saying complications, like I was some unwanted furniture he needed to dispose of. I kept thinking about Audrey, about the last few months before she died, and the more I thought about it, the more things didn't add up. I made coffee at 4 in the morning and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the envelope Stephen had given me. $5,000, such a small amount from such a vast fortune. But it wasn't the money that bothered me. It was what it represented, a dismissal, a final goodbye from the daughter I thought I knew. The morning light was just starting to filter through my windows when I decided to drive past Audrey's house. I told myself I just wanted to see it one more time before Stephen sold it and erased every trace of my daughter's life. But deep down, I think I was looking for answers. The mansion sat on 3 acres in Beverly Hills, behind iron gates that Audrey had never locked when she was alive. She used to joke that the neighborhood was so safe, the biggest crime was someone's gardener showing up late. But as I pulled up to the gates, I noticed they were not just closed, but had a new electronic lock system I'd never seen before. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, just staring at the house where my daughter had lived her final months. It looked different somehow. The gardens that Audrey had lovingly maintained were overgrown. The fountain in the circular driveway had been turned off, and several windows had their curtains drawn tight. It looked like a house where no one was happy. That's when the memories started flooding back. Uncomfortable memories I'd been pushing down since Audrey's death. 3 months ago, I'd come by unannounced with groceries, something I'd done every week for years. Audrey loved to cook, but she was always too busy to shop properly. When I rang the doorbell, it took nearly 10 minutes for someone to answer. When Audrey finally opened the door, she looked terrible. Thin, pale, with dark circles under her eyes, like she hadn't slept in days. "Dad, you can't just show up like this anymore," she'd said, barely opening the door wide enough to see me. "Stephen gets upset when we have unexpected visitors." I'd been hurt by that, but I told myself she was just stressed with work. Audrey had always been a perfectionist, and running a multi-million-dollar real estate business couldn't be easy. But looking back now, I remembered how nervous she'd seemed, how she kept glancing over her shoulder like she was afraid someone was listening. "Is everything okay, sweetheart?" I'd asked, trying to peer past her into the house. "Everything's fine, Dad. I just need you to call first from now on, okay?" Stephen likes to know when people are coming over. Stephen likes to know, not we like to know. or it would be better if you called first. Stephen likes to know, like he was making the rules in her own house. I'd left the groceries on the doorstep and driven home confused and hurt. When I called her later that day, Stephen answered her phone. "She's resting, Eric," he'd said. "The doctor has her on some new medication that makes her tired. Maybe give her a few days to adjust before you visit again." Medication? For what? Audrey had never mentioned being sick, and she'd always been the type to share everything with me. We talked every day, or at least we used to, but in those final months our conversations had become shorter, more stilted, like she was reading from a script. 2 months before she died, I'd tried to take her out for our monthly lunch date, a tradition we'd maintained for over 10 years. She'd canceled last minute, saying she wasn't feeling well. When I offered to bring soup over, she'd quickly said no, that Stephen was taking care of everything she needed. "I don't want to get you sick, Dad," she'd said. But her voice sounded strange, hollow. "Stephen says I'm contagious until the medication kicks in." I'd wanted to ask what medication, what illness, why she hadn't told me she was sick, but the conversation felt rushed, like she was eager to get off the phone. In the background I could hear Stephen's voice, though I couldn't make out the words. "I have to go, Dad. Stephen needs me for something." That was the last real conversation we'd had. After that, all our calls were brief, surface-level exchanges. "How's work? How's the weather?" Generic pleasantries that felt like talking to a stranger. Every time I suggested visiting or meeting for lunch, we had an excuse. Too busy, not feeling well. Stephen had planned something. Always Stephen. I started the car and drove home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something important, something that might have saved my daughter's life. Back in my kitchen, I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through the last few months of text messages between Audrey and me. What I found made my stomach turn. Her messages had changed completely in tone and style around 6 months ago. Where she used to write long, chatty texts, full of details about her day, her work, her plans, the recent messages were short and formal, almost businesslike. "Can't talk today, Dad. Busy with work. Feeling under the weather. Rain check on dinner? Stephen and I have plans this weekend. Maybe next time." It was like reading messages from a polite stranger, not from the daughter who used to send me pictures of funny dogs she saw on walks and long voice messages about her problems at work. I was about to put the phone down when I noticed something else. The timing of her messages. They were all sent during business hours, never in the evening or on weekends when she would typically text me. It was as if someone had scheduled them, or as if she was only allowed to contact me during certain hours. The thought made me sick, but it also made me angry. I called Audrey's assistant, Maria, who'd been with the company for years. If anyone would know what was really going on in Audrey's life these past months, it would be her. "Mr. Eric," Maria's voice was soft, sad. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Miss Audrey, she was such a good person. Maria, can I ask you something? In the last few months before Audrey passed, did you notice anything different about her? Any changes in her behavior or her health?" There was a long pause. "Sir, I probably shouldn't say anything, but..." She lowered her voice. "Miss Audrey, she wasn't herself these last months. She seemed scared all the time, looking over her shoulder. And Mr. Stephen, he started coming to the office every day, sitting in on all her meetings, making decisions about things that weren't his business." My heart started pounding. "Scared of what?" "I don't know, sir, but she stopped eating lunch, stopped talking to her friends. She used to call you every day from the office, remember? But Mr. Stephen said she wasn't allowed to make personal calls during work hours anymore. He said it was unprofessional." Not allowed. The words hit me like a physical blow. My successful, independent daughter, who owned the company, wasn't allowed to call her own father. "Maria, did Audrey seem sick to you?" Stephen mentioned she was on medication. Another pause. "Sir, Miss Audrey was taking a lot of pills these last months. I saw them on her desk sometimes, but she never looked sick to me, just tired. Very, very tired. Like she wasn't sleeping." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the wall, pieces of a horrible puzzle starting to come together in my mind. Stephen's eagerness to get rid of me, the changes in Audrey's behavior, the medication, the isolation, The fear Maria had noticed. My daughter hadn't just died. Something had been happening to her, something that had changed her from the vibrant, independent woman I'd raised into someone who was afraid to call her own father. And Stephen knew more about it than he was letting on. 3 days after my conversation with Maria, I was going through Audrey's old room in my house, the one she'd used whenever she stayed overnight in recent years. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just trying to feel close to her somehow. That's when I found the letter. It was tucked inside an old jewelry box I'd given her for her 16th birthday, hidden beneath the velvet lining. My name was written on the envelope in Audrey's familiar handwriting, but her usually neat script looked shaky, hurried. My hands trembled as I opened it. Dad, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and Stephen has probably told you it was natural causes. It wasn't. I need you to know the truth, even if I couldn't tell you while I was alive. Stephen has been poisoning me. I had to sit down. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I forced myself to keep reading. It started about 8 months ago, right after I told him I wanted a divorce. I'd discovered he'd been stealing money from my company, forging my signature on documents, using my business connections for his own investments. When I confronted him, he laughed and said I'd never leave him because I was too weak to start over alone. My daughter, weak? Audrey had built a multi-million-dollar business from nothing. She'd never been weak a day in her life. But Stephen had made her believe she was. He started putting something in my food, my drinks. I know how crazy that sounds, Dad, but I swear it's true. I began feeling sick all the time. Nauseous, dizzy, exhausted. When I went to doctors, Stephen always came with me, always spoke for me, told them I was stressed from work and having anxiety attacks. He convinced them to prescribe sedatives and anti-anxiety medication. I remembered those pills Maria had mentioned seeing on Audrey's desk. Not medication for an illness, but drugs to keep her compliant and confused. The worst part is that he isolated me from everyone, especially you. He said you were getting too old to understand my business decisions, that involving you in my life was holding me back. He monitored my phone calls, my emails, even my text messages. Dad, every text I sent you these past months, he either wrote himself or approved before I could send it. My chest felt tight. All those cold, distant messages I'd worried about, they hadn't even come from my daughter. I know you must be wondering why I didn't just leave, why I didn't call the police. Stephen has connections everywhere, Dad. He's been building relationships with judges, police officials, doctors. He showed me photos of you sometimes, told me about your daily routines, where you shop, when you go for walks. He said if I ever tried to leave or expose him, you would have an accident too. The letter fell from my hands. Stephen had threatened to kill me, to keep Audrey in line. My daughter had suffered in silence to protect my life. With shaking hands, I picked up the letter and continued reading. But I found a way out, Dad. A way to stop him and keep you safe. By the time you read this, you'll think I'm dead. Stephen will think I'm dead. Everyone will think I'm dead, but I'm not. My heart stopped. I read the sentence 3 times before it sank in. Remember Dr. Harrison, my college roommate Sarah's husband? He's helping me. We've created medical records showing I have a rare heart condition. When the time is right, he'll pronounce me dead. But it will all be fake. I'll be in a drug-induced coma that mimics death closely enough to fool everyone except a trained expert who knows what to look for. Dr. Harrison. I remembered him now. A quiet man who'd been at a few of Audrey's birthday parties over the years. Sarah had mentioned he specialized in emergency medicine. The funeral will be real, Dad, but the body in the casket won't be me. Dr. Harrison has arranged everything. I know this will hurt you terribly, and I'm so sorry for that. But it's the only way to get evidence of what Stephen has been doing, and to make sure he can never hurt either of us again. I was crying now. Relief and horror warring in my chest. My daughter was alive, but she'd had to fake her own death to escape her husband. Stephen will show his true colors once he thinks I'm gone. He'll reveal what he's really after, my money, my property, everything I worked so hard to build. But more importantly, he'll confess to what he did to me. Men like Stephen can't help bragging about their victories. The letter went on to explain the plan in detail. How Dr. Harrison would use a combination of drugs to slow Audrey's heart rate and breathing to nearly undetectable levels. How they'd arrange for a specific funeral home whose owner owed Dr. Harrison a favor. How Audrey would be hidden in a safe location while everyone believed she was dead. I need you to play along, Dad. I need Stephen to believe you're broken, defeated, that you're no threat to him. Let him think he's won completely. He'll get careless, and when he does, we'll have him. The final part of the letter made my blood run cold. Stephen has been keeping a journal, Dad. He writes down everything, how much poison he's been giving me, how it affects me, what symptoms to expect. He thinks of it as a scientific experiment. The journal is in his office at home, in the safe behind his desk. The combination is my birthday, 08/17/1987. When the time is right, we'll need that journal as evidence. At the bottom of the letter was a phone number I didn't recognize and instructions that made my heart race. When Stephen reveals his true nature to you, and he will, probably very soon after the funeral, call this number. Tell whoever answers that the dove has landed safely. They'll know what it means. Then put the phone on speaker and ask to talk to me. Stephen will think you've lost your mind with grief, but what happens next will destroy him forever. I sat in that room for over an hour, reading and rereading the letter until I had every word memorized. My brilliant, brave daughter had orchestrated her own death to trap the man who was slowly killing her. And now I had to play my part. The hardest part was the waiting. For 2 more days, I had to pretend to be the broken, defeated father Stephen expected me to be. I had to let him think his cruelty at the funeral had worked, that I was ready to take my $5,000 and disappear forever. On the 3rd day, Stephen called. "Eric, I hope you've had time to think about our conversation," he said, his voice taking on that fake, sympathetic tone that now made my skin crawl. "I've been worried about you." "I've been thinking," I said, making my voice sound tired and defeated. It wasn't hard. Part of me really was exhausted from carrying this secret. "About what you said, about Audrey wanting me to start fresh somewhere else." Good. I think that's very healthy, Eric. A new chapter in your life." "But Stephen, I need to understand something. I need to know that this is really what Audrey wanted, because it doesn't sound like her, you know? We were so close." There was a pause. "Well, Eric, the truth is that Audrey and I talked about this a lot in her final months. She was concerned about becoming a burden to you as she got older, and she was worried that you were becoming too dependent on her for emotional support." Lies. Every word was a lie, and now I knew it. "She thought it would be better for both of you if you learned to be independent," Stephen continued. "She loved you, Eric, but she felt that love had become unhealthy. The manipulation was breathtaking. Even now, even with Audrey supposedly dead and buried, Stephen was still trying to poison our relationship, still trying to make me doubt my daughter's love." "I see," I said quietly. "Well, if that's what she really wanted." "It is, Eric, trust me. Audrey and I had no secrets from each other." No secrets. The irony was almost funny. Stephen had no idea that his biggest secret, his wife's murder, was about to destroy him. "Actually, Stephen, there is one thing I'd like to ask you. Could I come by the house tomorrow? I'd like to see Audrey's office one more time, maybe take a few pictures to remember her by. Would that be okay?" "Of course, Eric. That sounds very healthy, very closure-oriented. Come by around noon. I have some business to take care of in the morning." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Stephen was making this almost too easy. His arrogance, his certainty that he'd won completely, was going to be his downfall. Tomorrow I would walk into my daughter's house for what Stephen thought would be the last time. But it wouldn't be a goodbye. It would be the beginning of his end. I arrived at Audrey's house the next day exactly at noon, my heart pounding so hard I was sure Stephen would hear it. I'd barely slept the night before, going over Audrey's letter again and again, memorizing every detail of the plan. The phone number was written on a piece of paper in my wallet, and I'd practiced the code phrase until it felt natural. Stephen answered the door wearing casual clothes, jeans and a polo shirt that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He looked relaxed, almost cheerful, like a man who'd just solved all his problems. "Eric, come in," he said, stepping aside with an expansive gesture. "I'm glad you decided to do this. I think it'll help with the healing process." Walking into that house knowing what I now knew was like entering a crime scene. Everything looked the same, but I could feel the evil that had happened here. Could imagine my daughter living in fear within these walls. "I've been doing some cleaning," Stephen said as we walked through the foyer. "Getting rid of things that are just too painful to keep around. You understand?" He was erasing her, wiping away every trace of Audrey's existence so he could enjoy his stolen fortune without reminders of what he'd done to get it. "Actually, Eric, before we go to Audrey's office, there's something I want to show you." Stephen's voice had changed, becoming more casual, more conversational. "Something I think you'll find interesting." He led me into the living room, where Audrey used to love reading, by the big windows overlooking the garden. On the coffee table was a thick folder filled with papers. "These are the real estate documents for your house," Stephen said, settling into the chair across from me. "I've already found a buyer. Nice young couple. They're offering $20,000 over asking price. Market's really hot right now." I stared at the papers, fighting to keep my expression neutral. "You're selling my house?" "Well, technically it's been Audrey's house since she bought it for you 5 years ago, and since I inherited everything." He shrugged like it was the most natural thing in the world. "The new owners want to move in by the end of the month, so you'll need to be out by then." End of the month. That was 3 weeks away. He was giving me 3 weeks to pack up my entire life and disappear. "Stephen, I don't understand. Audrey told me that house was mine. She said she wanted me to have security in my retirement." Stephen laughed, and there was something genuinely amused in the sound. "Oh, Eric, you really don't understand how these things work, do you? Audrey said a lot of things to make you feel better, but the legal reality is different. Everything she owned, everything she bought with her money, belongs to me now." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with something that made my skin crawl. "You know what the funny thing is? Audrey actually tried to change her will about 6 months ago. She wanted to leave you more money, maybe even give you the house outright. But I convinced her that wouldn't be fair to me, her husband. I told her you'd be fine with just a small token of her affection. 6 months ago, right around the time he'd started poisoning her, according to her letter, he'd manipulated her when she was already sick and confused. I'm a very persuasive person, Eric. I always get what I want in the end." The arrogance in his voice was staggering. He was actually bragging about manipulating my dying daughter. "Stephen," I said carefully, "can I ask you something, man to man?" "Of course." He settled back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. "Did Audrey suffer? At the end, I mean. Was she in pain?" Something flickered across Stephen's face. Not sadness or regret, but something much worse. Pride. "You know, Eric, that's a very interesting question." He stood up and walked to the bar cart in the corner, pouring himself a glass of expensive whiskey. "Would you like a drink?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice. "Audrey's death was peaceful," Stephen said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Very gradual. She just got weaker and weaker over time, like she was fading away. The doctor said it was her heart, but between you and me, I think it was more than that." He took a sip of his drink, watching me over the rim of the glass. "I think Audrey just lost the will to live. She'd been very depressed, you know. Very anxious about her business, about her relationship with you, about everything, really. Sometimes people just give up." The casual way he said it, like he was discussing the weather, made me want to grab him by the throat. But I forced myself to stay calm, to play the role of the grieving, defeated father. "He seemed different these last months," I said, distant. I worried that I'd done something wrong. "Oh, you did." Stephen's voice hardened. "You did plenty wrong, Eric. You were suffocating her, demanding too much of her time and attention. Audrey felt guilty about disappointing you, but she was tired of being responsible for your emotional well-being. More lies, more manipulation. Even with Audrey supposedly dead, he couldn't stop himself from trying to poison our relationship. She asked me to handle your situation as gently as possible," Stephen continued. "She didn't want to hurt your feelings by telling you directly that she needed space. So she asked me to take care of it after she was gone." "Take care of it?" I repeated. "Exactly. Like a final gift to you, the freedom to start over without the burden of feeling like you'd failed her somehow. He finished his whiskey and poured another, his movements getting looser, more confident. The alcohol was making him careless, just like Audrey had predicted. You know what the ironic thing is, Eric? Audrey was always worried about being a burden to people. She used to have nightmares about becoming one of those needy old women who guilt their children into taking care of them. But the truth is, you were the burden. You were holding her back from the life she really wanted. I clenched my fists in my lap, using every ounce of self-control I possessed to keep from lunging at him. What kind of life did she really want? I asked. Stephen smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen on a human face. A life without complications, without people constantly needing things from her, demanding her time and energy and emotional labor. She wanted to be free, Eric, and now she is free. My daughter was free because she'd had to fake her own death to escape this monster. Can I see her office now? I asked, standing up slowly like an old man defeated by life. I promise I won't take long. Of course. Stephen set down his glass and headed toward the stairs. But don't get too sentimental in there, okay? I'm having an estate sale company come next week to clear everything out. As we walked up the stairs, Stephen kept talking, his voice getting more relaxed with each step. You know, Eric, I have to admit something. I'm actually relieved this whole situation is finally resolved. These past few months have been very stressful, watching Audrey deteriorate, not knowing when the end would come. There were times when I thought about just speeding things along, putting her out of her misery. My blood turned to ice. He was confessing to considering murder, treating it like a mercy killing instead of what it really was, a calculated plan to steal my daughter's fortune. But nature took its course, he continued, opening the door to Audrey's office. Sometimes, the best thing you can do is just let things happen naturally. Nothing about what happened to Audrey was natural. Every symptom, every moment of suffering had been carefully orchestrated by the man walking beside me. Audrey's office looked exactly the same as it had months ago, her degrees on the walls, photos of properties she'd developed, the big desk where she'd built her empire. But I could see signs of Stephen's intrusion everywhere. Papers that had been moved, files that looked like they'd been searched, personal items that were missing. I'll leave you alone for a few minutes, Stephen said. But remember, Eric, this is goodbye. After today, I don't want to see you around here anymore. Audrey wouldn't have wanted you clinging to the past. As his footsteps faded down the hallway, I moved quickly to the desk. Hidden underneath a stack of business papers, exactly where Audrey's letter said it would be, I found Stephen's journal. The entries were methodical, clinical, written in Stephen's neat handwriting. Each page documented another step in my daughter's murder. Day 15, increased dosage again. Subject showing more pronounced symptoms, fatigue, nausea, confusion. Need to be careful not to accelerate too quickly. Day 32. Subject attempted to contact father directly, intercepted call, and explained she was too ill to talk. Considering increasing emotional isolation protocols. Day 47. Subject discovered financial irregularities in business accounts, administered increased dosage to induce severe disorientation, crisis contained. Page after page of cold, calculated evil. Stephen had been slowly killing my daughter for months, documenting every step like a scientist conducting an experiment. The final entry was dated just 2 days before Audrey's supposed death. Subject extremely weak now, barely able to function independently. Final phase ready to implement. After termination, will need to handle father's situation carefully. He suspects nothing but could become problematic if not managed properly. Consider relocation solution. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands shaking with rage. This journal was evidence of premeditated murder, detailed enough to convict Stephen of first-degree homicide. Stephen's voice echoed from downstairs. Eric, how are you doing up there? Take your time, but I do have another appointment this afternoon. I slipped the journal back under the papers and headed for the door. As I walked down the stairs, Stephen was waiting at the bottom, that same cold smile on his face. Feel better? He asked. Yes, I said quietly. I think I have everything I need now. I had no idea how right I was. 2 days after my visit to Audrey's house, Stephen called me again. This time, his voice had lost all pretense of sympathy or patience. "Eric, we need to finalize your departure arrangements. I've had the moving company scheduled for this Friday. They'll pack everything and put it in storage until you decide where you're relocating." "This Friday?" I kept my voice shaky, uncertain. "Stephen, that's only 3 days away. I haven't even found a place to move yet." "Well, that's what the $5,000 is for. Hotels, temporary housing, whatever you need while you figure things out. The point is, Eric, you can't stay here anymore. It's not healthy for either of us." I could hear the hardness creeping into his voice, the mask slipping away now that he thought he had complete control. "I understand," I said meekly. "But Stephen, could we meet one more time? There are some things of Audrey's that I'd like to ask about, some family photos and mementos. I promise, I'm not trying to claim anything valuable." There was a pause. "Fine. Come by tomorrow afternoon. But Eric, this is the last time. After tomorrow, if I see you anywhere near this property, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Of course, I understand completely. That night, I barely slept. I kept going over Audrey's plan, checking and rechecking that I had the phone number memorized, that I understood exactly what I needed to do. The most important thing was timing. I had to let Stephen reveal enough of his true nature to incriminate himself, but not so much that he became suspicious of my reactions. The next afternoon, I drove to the house one final time. At least, that's what Stephen believed. The gates were open, and Stephen's Porsche was parked in the circular driveway next to a large moving truck. My heart sank when I realized he was already having Audrey's belongings removed. Stephen met me at the front door, and immediately I could tell something was different. He was more agitated, less controlled than I'd ever seen him. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and there was an almost manic energy in his movements. "Eric, good you're here. We need to make this quick. I have buyers coming to look at the house tomorrow, and I want everything cleared out." "Buyers already? But Stephen, Audrey's only been gone for long enough," he snapped, his patience finally evaporating completely. "Look, Eric, let me be very clear about something. This grieving widower act I've been playing, it's exhausting. I'm ready to move on with my life, and that means getting rid of everything that reminds me of this whole messy situation." Messy situation. That's what my daughter's life and death had been to him. A messy situation to be cleaned up and forgotten. We walked into the living room where boxes were stacked everywhere and furniture was covered with moving blankets. It looked like a house being emptied after a death, which I supposed it was in a way. "Now, about these mementos you wanted," Stephen said, pouring himself a drink even though it was only 2 in the afternoon. "I've been very generous with you, Eric, but there are limits to my patience." I noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he lifted the glass. The stress of maintaining his facade, of managing all the details of his crime, was beginning to show. "I was hoping for just a few photos," I said carefully. "Maybe that picture of Audrey from her college graduation, or the one from her first real estate deal." Stephen laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You know what's funny, Eric? Audrey hated those pictures. She said they reminded her of a time when she was naive, when she believed that hard work and good intentions were enough to succeed in this world." Another lie? Audrey had loved those photos, had shown them to me just months before she supposedly died, talking about how proud she was of how far she'd come. "She learned better, of course," Stephen continued, taking a large sip of his drink. "She learned that in the real world you have to be smart about protecting what's yours. You have to be willing to make hard choices." Hard choices? Like realizing that some relationships are more burden than benefit. Like understanding that loyalty can be a weakness if you're not careful about who deserves it. Stephen was working himself up, the alcohol, and his sense of complete victory making him reckless with his words. "You know what Audrey told me, Eric? She told me that she wished she'd had the courage to cut ties with you years ago. She said you made her feel guilty for being successful, like she owed you something just because you raised her." The lies were getting more vicious, more desperate. Stephen needed me to believe that Audrey had never loved me, that our relationship had been a burden she was grateful to escape. She said the best thing about dying young would be that she wouldn't have to spend decades taking care of an aging father who expected her to sacrifice her own happiness for his needs. That was too much. Even knowing it was all lies, even knowing Audrey was alive and safe, hearing those words spoken in her house was like being stabbed. "That doesn't sound like Audrey," I said quietly. "Because you never really knew Audrey." Stephen's voice rose, his control finally snapping completely. "You knew the version of herself she performed for you, the dutiful daughter act she put on to keep you happy. But I knew the real Audrey, the one who was tired of pretending to care about people who added nothing to her life." He finished his drink and immediately poured another, his movements becoming erratic. "Do you want to know what she really said about you, Eric? She said you were pathetic. A lonely old man who never built anything meaningful of his own, so you had to live vicariously through her success. She said taking care of you was like carrying dead weight." I had to bite my tongue to keep from responding. Stephen was revealing himself completely now, showing me the cruelty that Audrey had lived with for months. "And you know what the beautiful thing is?" Stephen continued, his voice getting louder, more unhinged. "She never had to tell you any of this directly. She never had to hurt your feelings or deal with your emotional breakdown. She just let go, let nature take its course." He was talking about her death like it had been a choice she made, not a murder he'd committed. "I helped her with that," he said, and my blood turned to ice. "When she was suffering at the end, when the pain was too much, I helped her find peace. That's what love really is, Eric, knowing when to let someone go." This was it. This was the confession Audrey had known he wouldn't be able to resist making. "What do you mean, you helped her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Stephen smiled, and it was the most evil expression I'd ever seen on a human face. "I mean, I made sure she didn't suffer unnecessarily. When someone you love is in pain, you do whatever it takes to end that pain, even if it means making difficult decisions." I reached into my pocket for my phone, my hands trembling. "Stephen, are you saying you helped Audrey die?" "I'm saying I loved her enough to give her what she really needed." His voice was getting slurred now, the alcohol combining with his emotional state to make him completely reckless. "Unlike you, Eric, you would have kept her alive forever, watching her suffer, just so you wouldn't have to deal with being alone." I pulled out my phone and dialed the number Audrey had given me. Stephen was too drunk and too caught up in his own performance to notice. The phone rang once before someone answered. "Yes?" "The Dove has landed safely," I said, my voice shaking. Stephen looked at me with confused irritation. "Eric, what the hell are you doing? Who are you calling?" "Put it on speaker," the voice on the phone instructed. I hit the speaker button and set the phone on the coffee table between Stephen and me. "I'd like to speak to Audrey, please," I said loudly. Stephen's face went white. "Eric, what kind of sick joke is this? Audrey is dead. I watched them lower her into the ground." There was a brief pause, and then a voice came through the speaker that made Stephen's glass slip from his hands and shatter on the floor. "Hello, Stephen." It was Audrey's voice, clear and strong and very much alive. Stephen staggered backward, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally pure terror. "That's not possible. You're dead. I watched you die. I felt your pulse stop." "You felt what Dr. Harrison wanted you to feel." Audrey's voice came through the phone, calm and controlled. "The drugs he gave me slowed my heart rate to nearly nothing. But I was never actually dead, Stephen. Just deeply unconscious." Stephen was hyperventilating now, his hands clawing at his chest. No, this isn't real. You're dead. I made sure you were dead." "You made sure I appeared dead," Audrey corrected. "There's a difference. And while you've been celebrating your victory and planning to spend my money, I've been very much alive and listening to every word you've said to my father." The color drained completely from Stephen's face as the implications hit him. "You've been listening?" "To everything, Stephen. Your confession about poisoning me, your lies about what I supposedly said about my father, your admission that you helped me find peace. All of it recorded, all of it evidence of attempted murder." Stephen looked around wildly like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. "You can't prove anything. Even if you are alive, even if you recorded me, it's just your word against mine." "Actually, Stephen, it's not just my word." Audrey's voice remained maddeningly calm. "It's my word plus my father's testimony, plus the recording of your confession, plus your journal." Stephen's face went gray. "What journal?" The one you kept documenting every step of your plan to kill me. The one you hid in your office safe behind your desk. The one with entries like Day 15, increased dosage again, subject showing more pronounced symptoms. Should I continue? Stephen collapsed into his chair, the fight going out of him all at once. How did you? The safe combination is my birthday, Stephen. You're not as clever as you think you are. In the distance, I could hear sirens approaching. Stephen heard them too, and his head snapped up in panic. I called the police the moment you started confessing, Audrey's voice explained. They should be arriving right about now. The front door burst open, and police officers flooded into the living room. Stephen tried to stand, tried to run, but his legs gave out, and he fell to his knees. Stephen Morrison, the lead officer announced, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Audrey Morrison and conspiracy to commit fraud. As they handcuffed Stephen and read him his rights, he kept staring at the phone on the coffee table like it was some kind of supernatural phenomenon. This isn't over, he whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice anymore. You can't do this to me. It's already done, Audrey's voice replied. Goodbye, Stephen. The phone went silent and Stephen was led away in handcuffs, still shaking his head in disbelief. I was alone in the house that had been my daughter's prison, listening to the echo of her voice and feeling something I hadn't felt in months: hope. The police station was buzzing with activity when I arrived an hour after Stephen's arrest. Detective Martinez, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, met me in the lobby. Mr. Holloway, I understand this has been an extraordinary situation for you, she said, leading me to a quiet conference room. We'll need your full statement, but first, there's someone who's been waiting to see you. She opened the door, and there was my daughter. Audrey looked thin and pale, but she was alive, she was breathing, she was real. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she smiled, that same smile I'd been missing for months, and I broke down completely. Dad, she whispered, and then she was in my arms, both of us crying like we hadn't cried since her mother died. I'm so sorry, she kept repeating. I'm so sorry I had to put you through that. I'm sorry you had to think I was dead. Don't you dare apologize, I said, holding her tight enough to convince myself she was really there. You did what you had to do. You survived. We sat in that conference room for hours while Audrey told me everything. The months of systematic poisoning, the isolation, the threats against my life that had kept her trapped. She explained how she'd reconnected with Dr. Harrison through social media, how they'd developed the plan to fake her death, how terrifying it had been to trust her life to someone else's medical expertise. The hardest part wasn't the drugs or the fake death, she said, her voice breaking. It was knowing you were suffering, thinking you'd lost me, and not being able to comfort you. But you found a way to fight back, I said. You found a way to beat him. Detective Martinez joined us with updates on Stephen's situation. He's been charged with attempted murder in the first degree, fraud, theft, and several other felonies. The journal you photographed, combined with the recorded confession and the medical evidence Dr. Harrison preserved, makes this one of the strongest cases I've ever seen. He paused, studying both of us carefully. I have to ask, are you both prepared for what comes next? This is going to be a high-profile case. Stephen's family has money and connections. They're going to try to discredit your story, claim this was all an elaborate fraud. Audrey straightened in her chair, and I saw a flash of the strong, determined woman who'd built a business empire from nothing. Let them try. We have the truth, and we have evidence. Stephen made one crucial mistake. He couldn't resist bragging about what he'd done. Over the next few weeks, as the legal process unfolded, I watched my daughter reclaim her life piece by piece. The first step was having the death certificate officially voided, which required extensive medical testimony from Dr. Harrison and several other experts. The media picked up the story, dubbing it the resurrection case. But Audrey handled the attention with grace and determination. Stephen's lawyers tried every angle they could think of. They claimed Audrey had faked her death to commit insurance fraud, even though she'd never filed any insurance claims. They suggested she'd made up the poisoning story to frame Stephen for a crime that never happened, until the medical tests showed traces of the slow-acting toxins still in her system. They even tried to argue that Stephen's confession had been coerced until the recordings made it clear he'd been bragging voluntarily. But the evidence was overwhelming. Stephen's journal alone contained enough detail to convict him, but combined with the medical evidence, the recorded confession, and testimony from people like Maria who'd witnessed Audrey's deterioration, the case was airtight. The trial lasted 6 weeks. I attended every day, watching Stephen grow more haggard and desperate as his lies unraveled in front of the jury. When the verdict came back, guilty on all counts, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Stephen was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, he turned to look at Audrey one last time, his face twisted with hate and disbelief. She met his gaze steadily, unflinching, and I was proud of her strength. The defendant showed no remorse for his actions, the judge said. He systematically tortured and attempted to murder his wife for financial gain, then continued to lie and manipulate even after his arrest. This court finds that he represents a continuing danger to society. After the trial, Audrey and I went back to her house. Our house, really, since she'd immediately put my name on the deed once she legally existed again. We sat in the garden where she'd once loved to read, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Do you think you'll be able to stay here?" I asked. "After everything that happened in this house?" Audrey was quiet for a long moment. I thought about selling it, moving somewhere with no memories. But then I realized Stephen doesn't get to take this away from me, too. I loved this house before he poisoned it, and I can love it again now that he's gone. She reached over and took my hand. "Besides, this is where we planned his downfall. This is where I wrote that letter to you, where I found the courage to fight back. Maybe the bad memories will fade, but I want to remember that I was strong enough to survive." 6 months later, Audrey's business was thriving again. She'd had to rebuild relationships with clients who'd been confused by her death and resurrection, but her reputation for integrity and innovation carried her through. She even hired Maria as her new business partner, recognizing the loyalty and courage Maria had shown during the darkest months. I moved into the guest house on Audrey's property, close enough to be part of her life, but far enough to give her independence. We had dinner together twice a week and talked on the phone every day. Real conversations, not the monitored, scripted exchanges Stephen had controlled. One evening, as we were barbecuing in the backyard, Audrey brought up something that had been on both our minds. "Dad, do you think I'll ever be able to trust someone enough to get married again?" I considered the question carefully. "I think you'll be able to trust yourself enough to know when someone deserves your trust. That's different from what you had before." "Stephen wasn't always evil," she said softly. "In the beginning he was charming, attentive, everything I thought I wanted. I keep wondering if I missed warning signs, if I was just naive." "You weren't naive, sweetheart. You were trusting, which is a beautiful quality. Stephen was the one who chose to abuse that trust. Don't let his evil make you cynical about love." She smiled, and I could see some of the old Audrey in her expression, the optimistic, hopeful woman who believed in the goodness of people. "You know what the strangest thing is?" she said. "I'm grateful for what happened in a weird way. Not for the suffering, not for the fear, but for learning how strong I really am. I survived something that should have destroyed me, and I fought back. I saved my own life." "You saved both our lives," I corrected. "Stephen would have killed me eventually, too, once he got tired of the charade." That night, I lay in bed thinking about the journey we'd been on together. The months of thinking my daughter was dead, the devastating grief, the shocking discovery that she was alive, the terror of the plan we'd had to execute together. It had been the worst and most frightening experience of my life, but it had also shown me something important about the bond between a parent and child. Stephen had tried to break that bond with lies and manipulation. He'd convinced himself that he could make Audrey forget her love for me, that he could rewrite the story of our relationship to serve his purposes. But love like ours, real love, built on years of genuine care and mutual respect, couldn't be destroyed by a poisonous outsider. A year after Stephen's conviction, Audrey threw a party. Not a celebration of his imprisonment, but a celebration of life, of survival, of the family that had proven stronger than the forces trying to tear it apart. Dr. Harrison was there along with Maria, Detective Martinez, and a dozen other people who'd helped us through the darkness. As I watched Audrey laugh and talk with her friends, I marveled at her resilience. She'd been through hell, but she'd emerged stronger, wiser, more compassionate. She'd started a support group for abuse survivors, using her experience to help other women recognize the warning signs of financial and emotional manipulation. "Dad," she said, pulling me aside during the party, "I have something for you." She handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a watch, not expensive or flashy, but engraved with a simple message: "To the father who never gave up hope. Love, Audrey." "I wanted you to have something to mark this day," she said, "the day we officially put the past behind us and started building our future." I hugged her tight, feeling the steady beat of her heart against my chest. The heart that Stephen had tried to stop, that Dr. Harrison had made appear to stop, that was now beating strong and free. "I love you, sweetheart," I whispered. "I love you too, Dad, and I'm never going anywhere again." As the party continued around us, I realized that Stephen had been wrong about everything. He'd thought that love was weakness, that family was burden, that loyalty was something to be exploited. But he'd learned too late that real love, the kind that exists between a father and daughter who truly know and respect each other, is the strongest force in the world, strong enough to survive poisoning, manipulation, and even death itself, strong enough to bring justice to those who deserve it, strong enough to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. Stephen was spending the rest of his life in prison, but Audrey and I were free. Free from his lies, free from his control, free to love each other without fear or manipulation. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the lights in Audrey's house, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year: complete peace. My daughter was alive, she was safe, and she was home. Justice had been served, but more importantly, love had won.